Hello and welcome everyone to another podcast of OUVC. Today our topic will be presentation skills and communication of entrepreneurs. I'm accompanied by Imre Hild, our CEO at OUVC, and our guest today is Willy Benko, who is a serial entrepreneur, a communication trainer, actually the founder of Speech Academy, and he's pretty much the biggest expert, I think, here in Hungary in this topic. So welcome very much.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to ask you about your biggest takeaways, your biggest conclusions in the past years. What the biggest trends and most important things are right now regarding the communication of startups?
Thankfully, today, unlike 15 years ago, startups are realizing that it's not enough to have a good idea. You need to be able to package it, and you need to be able to get somebody who has money in their pocket to also be excited about it. And finally, I'm starting to see not only startups, but even mature companies that are putting money and time into, my goodness, I got to raise the communication skill of my staff. And it's exciting to see that Hungary is maturing and going down this path.
Right.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that there's one thing that we always emphasize about startups and communication. You know, you have to have the perfect pitch. You have to have your presentation down. But at the end of the day, I think it has much more effect on the company other than just being effective in communicating the idea of the company to investors. Because through such effective communication, they learn how to sell. And I think that's the kind of the blood of the organization. How to sell, how to be able to communicate your value, your ideas within the organization, your self-worth within the organization, and how to communicate to the consumer or to the clients in comparison to the competition. So I think communication is a very complex and very effective tool to improve the company throughout.
Absolutely. One skill that people are realizing today, that instead of selling their product or their service, they're realizing that they need to first sell the result of whatever their product or service delivers. And if the customer gets excited about that service, then they'll buy whatever leads to that level or that quality of service. And it's not the product. It's, do I like or do I want what the product does for me?
In a way, they first have to sell themselves, right? So they have to work with a very, very short attention span of investors. So you have like one sentence before they get bored. If it's not the right wording, the right key points, then you lose the investor immediately.
You could. I don't think it's that critical. You could say something wrong and then people get turned off. Today, our competition is something electronic. Yeah, most often it's a telephone. And if you're boring, people are going to pull their phone out. You have to accept the fact that normal people, if they're bored, will reach for their phone because normal people don't like to be bored. That being said, there is meta communication, how you hold yourself. I can have a perfect line memorized and deliver it, but if there's something about the way I hold myself, I'm not willing to look in their eyes, there are other small little signals that tell me, that is almost too good, too perfect. There's some people, Musk is a good example. He is not a great speaker, but there's just so much credibility behind him. Now, you don't have to like him. He is doing some pretty serious things. And you just feel the gravitas, the weight of his brain when you're in the same room with him. And you don't care if he ahs a little bit. Now, if you're not that smart, then the bar gets raised a little bit and they're less forgiving. But you don't have to be perfect. You do have to believe what you're selling. Because if you don't believe what you're selling, people will figure it out quickly.
Yeah. And I think going back to what you said earlier, you have to sell the solution and then they will buy the process that leads you there. In the case of startups, the solution is the company, the promised value proposition, what's at the end of the rainbow, and in my thesis, the process that leads there is the entrepreneur. So you're basically buying the entrepreneur on day one. There's not much else, and And those entrepreneurs who realize that it's one thing what you tell us a story about the company, but the metaphysics, how it comes across, how convincing you are, even subconsciously, how much I believe that, well, there is something in this person that is attractive, that is actually engaging, and it's going to be as engaging with clients as he or she is right now. That is something that as for myself, that's what I'm looking for. Is there that kind of a magnetic power of the entrepreneur? I find it rarely, but when I find it, I stick with that person.
Right. You have to communicate solution and drive. What drives you and what drives the company? How efficient it can be. So how much can I believe you?
Right. Well, one thing that I would look for in somebody who's an entrepreneur is they may not have the final version of what they're capable of or what their product will do. One of the examples that I learned when I used to live in Dallas was that when a bird sits on a branch of a tree and is whistling and seems to enjoy life, it's not because the branch supports them. It's because the bird knows that if the branch breaks, they can fly. And if I start down this path with one version, do I have the confidence to be able to pivot or go off in a different direction? Am I self-confident enough to accept Imre's feedback that, boy, that idea ain't going anywhere, but try this? Will my ego allow me to accept input from somebody else and use that to alter the direction that I'm going?
Yeah, absolutely. They have to learn to roll with it.
That's right.
And obviously, the more it actually comes across that person knows how to roll with it, and I think that's why we're looking for former failures very often in these individuals, because once they go through one or two failures, then we're like, okay, so they're not going to cry that much
Right.
after the third, the fourth, and the fifth, and they learn that they have to roll with it, and that's a skill that cannot be really explained or taught. It has to be experienced.
Right.
For sure.
That's where they say it's not taught, it's caught. Can you
It's caught.
experience it?
You're right. Yeah.
And then roll with that new experience? Or do you end up going into psychotherapy and have to take drugs for the next 6 months of your life?
Yeah.
Yeah, flexibility and self-reflection are key pretty much, because if you can't reflect on your previous work and adjust, be flexible, then you'll go nowhere because you are not learning anything. You don't take away anything at the end of the day.
True. Plus, I'm not looking for an entrepreneur who's good at falling in love with their idea. There are a lot of people who fall in love with their ideas, and we don't hear much about this, but I'd be curious to know how different the Amazon product that ultimately got launched, how different was that from Bezos' original idea on how we should do this? Or Musk, when he took over control of Tesla, how does it look today versus what he thought it was going to look like? And these guys do it in such a wonderful way that you don't even realize that they're making a moderate adjustment to the direction, almost like a pilot that's getting a side wind that wasn't calculated, and it's elegantly reacted to.
Yeah.
And the plane lands what it's supposed to land. And how we got there, don't know. I'm just happy with the result.
It's kind of like, let's just fly with it and we'll figure it out.
Right.
And very often this, we often talk about change in a negative way, and we can talk about change in a positive manner also. When there's a startup launched, 3-4 months down the road, something huge happens, something huge, very, very huge positive impact thing happens. Maybe they have a huge client, they have a new advisor who signs on, who opens millions of doors. And what I find that very often startups are scared or startled by that. Like, oh, how am I going to deal with that? I have a plan which is approved by my investors, so now I have to break that plan. Rather not, because then the money will dry up. So they want to stick with the pre-calculated plan, which is based on nothing or very little, and they actually let go of real opportunities. So very often I say to startups that what they have to practice is how to capture opportunities efficiently, because just thinking that there is an opportunity and they're chasing it for years, like there is an opportunity where there is none, and then they don't see a real opportunity that is a bit off the path, and they just give up, looking for that. So in my book, curiosity is a very important skill.
Why don't they teach young kids in elementary and high school? Why don't they make it mandatory that students have to be able to express themselves well.
Yeah.
Why is that not a requirement?
It should
And
be.
It should be, but
Clearly.
why isn't it?
Well, I think I think one thing probably it roots somewhere in the culture that I don't know. Maybe it's just not that much of a extrovert culture. Who people feel always very self-conscious when they stand on the stage and like, oh my God, everybody's looking at me, even when nobody's looking at them or
True.
few people are looking at them. It has this kind of a mystique, at least in my past 50 some years, that people think a lot more of it than what it really is, and they don't practice it enough in
Right.
in the early years. And I think looking back, looking at what's going on in elementary school of my son, I can see that the smaller the group, the better it is, because the more speaking time or the more presentation time they have, even in a class. I remember when I was in elementary school in Hungary, there were weeks that went by without me saying a word,
Wow.
publicly or standing up. There were 41.
That's almost criminal.
41 students in a class. So
Double criminal.
yeah. So where my son goes now, there are like 15 kids. So they actually have to. They have to be prepared all the time, because there's a higher chance that they will be called upon. And on the other hand, these kids, I find that they see a lot more good examples. We haven't seen that, at least my
Right.
generation or
Right.
even younger generations. It wasn't very, very typical that people sit in front of a microphone or standing up on a stage and talking to a larger crowd. And I think that's changing pretty drastically in the last 20 years. But still, we are way behind many other cultures
Right.
that we know in the world.
Then international examples are more and more available to everyone. So you can see how they do it in the US.
Yeah.
You can see how they do it in
Right.
Western cultures, where everyone's a bit more extroverted, more open. And that's one thing that we have to adjust to, because right now it's a disadvantage of Hungarian startups. They can't properly communicate their needs or their offers even.
Right. In the US, it's no longer considered, and hasn't been for many years, as a nice to have. It is a skill you need to get. Because you look around and you see your friends, you see other startuppers, and they can communicate well, and they can explain it using pictures, and they can create a vision, and people love that. And that's your competition. Maybe it's not a smartphone if you're pitching in Silicon Valley, but you're going to have to be able to be a darn good storyteller to get people to buy into, because there are so many good stories that you can invest in.
Yeah. Interestingly, about 7 or 8 years ago, I had the experience that I took a couple of Hungarian startups and startuppers to the US, first to East Coast and the West Coast. And when we arrived, it was a very stereotypical, arrival. We went to a networking event, and there were the Hungarian startups standing there, scared. They didn't even talk to each other, let alone, the Americans. And so I asked them, like, what are you doing here? I'm like, we are at a networking event. Don't talk to each other. And they're like, well, Imre, we don't know anyone. I'm like, I know, that's why it's a networking event. So I grabbed the arm of one of them, and we walked up to someone, and I said, do you know a really good Hungarian developer? No. Well, here is one. So, start the conversation. Now, these guys who were quintessential shies, in Hungarian we call them kocka, like the real typical geeks, in 1 month, so not in a day, not in 2 days, but in 1 month when we came back, they really turned into a very, very good approximation of an American startupper. They were speaking loud, they were speaking understandably, they looked in the other person's eyes, and they were really curious what they are thinking. And when they were not understanding what they were saying, or they were not interested in it, they switched topic to something that was interesting to them. So when we came back, I brought back a couple of transformed guys. I wanted to show it to the Hungarian ecosystem. Like, look at these guys. So I organized an event. I made them sit on the stage, and the audio system broke down. And I was like, oh my God, wait a second, we're gonna fix your microphones. And one of the guys said, no, Imre, we don't need microphones. We can speak loud enough. And he stood up and he was like beaming, like, telling everybody all the stories that happened to them. People looked at me like, what did you do? What did you do to these guys? And guess what happened in 2 months? Back down. Back into their shells, slowed down because of the environment, because of the context in which they operate. Here it's not expected to speak loudly and be really interested in what the other people
Are they
say.
still here in Hungary?
Yeah.
And are they still the old?
Reserved. Very reserved guys, yes.
Wow, that's interesting. Because normally when you break through that barrier and you start to find it easier to communicate and talk to people, that becomes almost like a drug. You feel like, my goodness, I can meet new people. I can see a different world.
Yeah, I think, I'm sure that some people react like that.
Right.
Well, they didn't. But
they didn't.
But I think the interesting message is that they have the material inside them.
That's right.
They are dropped in the right context and they are immediately just like that.
Right. Often when somebody asks me to work with them, the first thing I do is try to get them to understand that they don't need to make up interesting stories. Their life already consists of interesting stories. And I give them permission to use that example when you were in Aldi, or show what you felt when you were mistreated at another grocery store, their competitor. Use those stories because you don't have to memorize those. Those are inside, and you can use that. You can bring it out, and you can use it to make your story, or not your story, your presentation a whole lot more interesting. I think people are looking for that magic bullet. I got to read that one more book. But the fact is, you're carrying most of the interesting stories in your life with you. And whether it's on a Lufthansa plane or Wizz Air, I guarantee you, you cannot live a day, for example, in Budapest without experiencing. They say if you want to get your kids to talk to you when they come home from school, don't ask them, what was your day like? Because normally they'll answer, well, okay, and then they keep going. Rather, ask them, tell me something today that made you mad, glad, or sad. And you can't answer that in one word. And then they start to talk about when somebody slammed the door in front of them, they couldn't get on the bus, and that made me mad.
Yeah, sure.
Right? And that happens with all of us. We're like Google tags. I guarantee you, if you live a day in this city, you'll be happy, you'll be sad, and you'll be mad. And you can take those stories and weave them into an interesting presentation, whether it's a startup or you're trying to motivate young people.
For sure. And one of the key issues, I think, is that people most commonly mistake professional experience with communicational skills. So you ask the person with the most professional background to have a speech, and they don't even know, they don't realize that maybe someone else should help them with their speech. They have to prepare with a professional. They need help, outside help, and work on their communication skills. Just because technological or professional background doesn't necessarily mean you can talk about your experiences properly. You don't realize this.
That's right. We used to have, I don't want to mention the name because who knows, he might hear it and then he'd be offended, but we had a situation where we were once a quarter holding an update meeting with 150 employees. And we put together the speaker list, and we inevitably put somebody on the speaker list that was horrible. And I'd say, well, he doesn't know how to speak, but he's a vice president, but he doesn't know how to speak. And they were adamant about making sure that because he was a vice president, he would speak. And the consequence was, since we were in a movie theater at 10 o'clock from 10 to 11, is when he spoke for 15 minutes, the 150 people slept. It was comfortable. It was dark. It was comfortable, more comfortable in their chair than in the office. And they were excited that this person would speak, even though he wasn't any good. I agree, you don't need a professional. We talked yesterday about what are some of the tricks that you can immediately begin to use when you're presenting. One thing is to learn new things. That takes time. But the easiest is to stop doing negative things and stop doing those immediately. One of them is often we are guilty of taking the power out of what we're saying. Let's say that I work for OUVC, the university. Yeah. And I get up on stage and I say, OUVC is the best university in the world, I think. And by adding I think to the end of the sentence, I just took all the power out of it. Now, I understand we were raised by conservative grandmothers and they want us to be humble. But unless your grandmother is in that audience, forget the I think. When you're on stage, you're expected to be a guru and you're expected to be able to portray power. Yeah. It's number one. Number two, even if it's not very good or it's not perfectly assembled, damn it, practice. The first thing your audience will notice is you get up there, and if you haven't practiced, you're not prepared, you're going to feel nervous. And you're going to alert the audience that that person who knows theoretically everything about this topic, if they're nervous, how should I feel? And you can cut it out. I don't like to use words like this in podcasts or on stage, but as an economist, we had a rule, and the rule was simple. Shit rolls downhill. And if I'm nervous, my audience becomes nervous. If I'm confident, my audience becomes confident. And part of that is a term in psychology they call social proof. I need to show the audience how to react to my presentation. If I'm nervous, they're going to model my behavior. They're going to do, right? Imre, look, Imre's scared. Then, oh my goodness, I'm going to be scared. Yeah. And since most people don't like to be scared, as soon as they start to experience the fear, they immediately reach for something that is the digital equivalent of an antidepressant. And that's called a phone.
Yeah. I think that what you just mentioned about, practicing and the benefit of practicing, going back to my story about those two guys who became such good presenters in the course of 1 month. I didn't mention that on the plane, as we were going to the US, they asked me, Imre, how many times do we have to pitch in a day in the US? And I told them, I assume that you will have to pitch about 5 or 6 times a day. And they were horrified. They were like, oh my God, we are not prepared.
Right.
And what actually happened is that they pitched 300 times in a month. So at the end, they were so confident. They didn't really have to think about, how to turn the sentence, how to actually, line up reasons why, a customer or whatever partner has to work with them. It came naturally. It flowed naturally because they practiced it so much. And your first point, I also have a good one about that, is that in Hungarian, szerintem, right? I think.
Absolutely.
I like to say that szerintem is probably the most expensive word. Absolutely. Because, szerinted, that's a pretty small market. Yep. So why don't you come back to me with the validation or with the opinion of the real big market? So, and I think that's a really great advice. Chop off the szerintem part or the I think part, and the whole thing is going to change its meaning. It is going to gain relevance. It's going to gain authority, because authority is also something that people like to follow, not only the audience, but the company itself that you're leading.
Right. I'm working with a group of professionals at an investment banking firm right now. And one of the bad habits that they have, especially if you have to speak in English, is when you're silent and then you begin to speak, often people look for an on-ramp on the highway where you gain speed. And for many people, it's the word so. They'll go from being silent to so, and then they get to whatever they wanted to say. Or and then they go. And those are also words that you need to get rid of. Not reduce, you need to get rid of them. You need to get rid of the szerintem. You need to be confident, because if I'm confident, the other side will be confident. And where most people fail is they don't have anybody around them who is honest with them. We try to limit the damage. You did a pretty good job. What the hell does a pretty good job mean? It should be binary. You either did a good job or you didn't do a good job. In Texas, we used to have this saying, you do not blow sunshine up somebody's butt. That's being nice, and everything they do it is not perfect. And if you're willing to be honest, you'll do more to help that young startupper and say, don't tell them this wasn't good. Tell them this wasn't good, and this is how you can make it better. And then show them. And they will love you. They will eat up your words. And it doesn't take a long time to realize, because you can feel the difference. And when you start to feel the power on the inside, you're starting to think, wait a minute, I could do this. And boy, you get somebody to invest in a startup, and that'll give you a boost of self-confidence. But you can't ride that self-confidence forever.
Yeah.
And they're only words.
Yeah, you really need as much experience as possible, as much opportunities to pitch or just to communicate in general, and you need the proper feedback. If
You need the feedback.
Yeah, and you have to be just aware of what that feedback means, what kind of steps you took, what you have to do next. So I use so too much as well, or I used to use it way too much, and then first I grew aware of the problem, and then you with small steps you just work it out, and you get better and better.
Right. One bad habit in Hungarian is people don't look for a synonym. They stack the nagyons. Something is nagyon fontos, the next thing is nagyon fontos, and you get to a point where if everything is very important, then nothing is very important. And there's so many, if Hungarian is a rich language, then find that darn synonym and don't overuse the word nagyon. But that takes a little bit of caring about what it's like for the audience to hear what you're saying and to prepare it so they enjoy it. After all, my presentation is for them, for their consumption, not my own consumption.
Yeah, it's like similar to just writing your thesis. Like the last step is always someone else has to read it. Someone else has to hear it, because at that point you can't see it from the outside. So you can't be that third party that has a fresh opinion. You have to have someone that gives you the proper feedback.
That's right. Honest feedback.
Yeah, for sure.
And honest feedback without emphasizing honesty.
Right.
You know, like in Hungarian, őszinte leszek.
Right.
It's like, well, weren't you honest?
Those are filler terms too that you need to get rid of. The Hungarians tend to overuse ugye, gyakorlatilag,
igazándiból.
That's not even a word. Őszintén szólva. The Americans or the English speaking will say actually, basically, to be honest with you. Those all go in the kuka. You do not use those ever, unless you're quoting somebody who said that. You don't need those. You speak at about 120 words a minute. If you had 5 minutes to do a pitch, that's 600 words. And when you start putting in phrases like, to be honest with you, you've taken away valuable real estate from a statement that would have much greater power than to be honest with you. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's a bad habit.
That's right. The other thing that I think I think we should highlight about startup communication is that, in my experience, there are two basic major groups of communicators. The one who is willing to engage the other party in a dialogue. And they're talking back and forth, listening to the other person, responding to that, admitting if they don't know the answer, and strongly emphasizing if they do, and then they try to convince the other person if they think that they are right. And then there is the other group, the bigger group, who are defensive. That no matter what you tell them, no matter what you ask, they're always defending their original position, like it's unchangeable. It's almost like blockchain. It cannot be muted. It is the way it is. No matter how you are trying to break through that veil of protection, and that's really annoying. When you're sitting on the investor side, or actually on a partner side. Like you come here with a software that is capable of anything. No matter what I'm asking, you always have the answer to everything. That actually turns authenticity and turns credibility way down. So I always tell these startups that a one don't know has a lot more value than I know everything.
That's right. I agree. But they need to feel safe in using that.
Yeah.
They may have grown up in an environment where they always had to have the right answer. And any time they were wrong, they were either ostracized or teased for it.
Penalized. Yeah.
Penalized. Absolutely. That's a good way. I mean, I kind of grew up in a family like that there was no democracy. There was no, well, let's talk about that. There was one opinion. It was my dad's opinion, and that's the way it was. And we never sat down and said, would you be interested in the way I see things? That's one statement that was never said, because it wouldn't have been listened to anyway.
Yeah, and when you are trying to convince the other one, just too much, just not being flexible at all. I think the hidden message is also that you're not really sure of your message either. You really want to validate it for yourself by convincing the other. So I'm right, and if I can convince you that I'm right, then perhaps I'm right, but I'm not sure really. So it's a red flag immediately, because that means that you're unsure of yourself.
Obama said sometimes the best argument is to let the other side keep talking. And often people, if you let them talk, they keep talking, and eventually they'll say something that is either dumb or contradictory, and they'll take care of themselves in losing their credibility.
Yeah. I think that silence is a very, very, I used very twice. Silence is a very often overlooked tool, I think, in a communicator's toolbox, because I use it very often. When I don't have anything else to say, or I don't have any question, I just shut up. And that confuses the heck out of the other side. Like, what's going on now? Do I need to say something else? And then they actually spill the beans.
That's right.
And they come forward with a lot of new information I never thought about asking.
Right. There's a simple, easy to memorize statement about silence. When you increase the length of the pause, that creates tension, and tension becomes a tool. They say without tension, there is no attention. And that is something you actively should use and would want to use to influence the other side. If you want them to be drawn in a little bit, to pay attention, put in a pause, and they don't know what's going to happen, like you just said, Imre, and they're going to lean in because they want to know, they don't want to miss it.
Exactly. And it's true in a one-to-one conversation and also on stage.
Absolutely.
When you leave the pause hanging there.
Right.
Yeah, I think a couple of years back when you had a pitch session in Europe for startups, that was the main takeaway, that you have to just think about what you actually want to give to the audience, what your message is, what your proposal is, and you have to emphasize that by silence either or by just starting with a statement or something that actually gets their attention.
Right. You do want to start off with something powerful.
Right.
And powerful is not introducing yourself and saying, oh, I couldn't find a parking spot. No, you need to hit them hard and then follow it up with a pause and then go into your story, or if there's an outline on how you should pitch, whether it's defining the problem and then the solution, whatever that is. But you need to grab people's attention, and starting slow and saying, oh, I'm kind of scared is the easiest way to lose the attention of the audience. I'm not interested in listening to somebody who's scared.
Yeah. There is another sacrilegious thing that I often mention to startups when they put together the pitches or their pitch book, repeating things. They try to avoid it at all costs. They don't want to repeat the same thing in their presentation. And I learned it from some of the best communicators, that repeating a short but very powerful message, leave a pause and repeat it, and it sinks in like nothing. I mean, let people think it through, because very often when you're talking about your topic, you know it well. The audience doesn't.
That's right.
It's new to them. It's like riding through a new town in a car at 120 miles. It's hard to catch everything. Why don't you just show them what is really important and repeat it?
That's right.
Nobody ever came up to those startups like, "Hey, you repeated that sentence." No. Obviously not. But the fact that they really want to bring home a point, that was really clear.
I agree. This is a little off topic. There used to be a cigarette commercial in the U.S., Winston cigarettes, and the line or the little song for it was, "Winston tastes good like a cigarette should." Almost rhymes perfectly. And one of the tricks that speakers will use is they'll use a popular phrase. They'll say the first half, and then they'll pause, turn the microphone towards the audience, and the audience finishes it. And that's a way to engage them. If you taught, for example, one of the tools I use is when I moved to Texas, I realized that Texans answer questions a little bit differently. Texan would say, if the answer was no, they would say not only no, but hell no, adding emphasis to it. And I teach that to groups that I work with. And in the beginning, I show them, I tell them about what Texans did. And then 20 minutes later, I bring it back and I say, not only no, and then they come back with hell no. And when you can get them to repeat something, you now have them engaged. And you want, whether it's for an investment, whether it's a regular presentation, you want your people, you want to engaged.
Engaged, yes.
Yes, and pretty much the best way is interactions.
That's
so
right.
If you interact with your audience, with the partner you discuss business with, if they have no saying in what you talk about at all, you just have your little speech, then you lose them immediately. Like I've been to meetings where it was like 90 minutes long and the startup was talking for 75 minutes with no feedback at all. It's a pointless meeting. It's a long email. At the end
That
of
is
the
a
day.
long email, especially if they're talking about technical stuff.
Right.
Right. If you're going to, we call it speeds and feeds. If you're going to tell me about stuff that can be written down, that's data, send that to me in an email. Tell me the story. Get me excited. Seeing 5 gigahertz doesn't get me excited.
Yeah, and you really have to know your audience. So who you are talking to, you have to be casual, you have to be professional, what they want to take away, what their intention is in the meeting. So with investors, it's usually the one slide that's always missing from the pitch decks and the pitches is return. So I invest here, and what do I get in return?
Right.
And the startup doesn't even know. I ask them, and they can't really reply because they never thought about communicating anything about the potential return. They do something, it's good for the customer, then it's of course good for the investor as well. It's not that way.
That's
at all.
not necessarily true. That's correct. Absolutely.
Yeah, the other thing to this point is that I don't know in your experience how it is, but in my experience, at least 60-70% of the times when they invite me for an event to speak, they tell me what the event's title is and that, what I should be probably talking about. And always the first question I always have, who's the audience? Well, we don't know. Well, then, what should I talk about, really? I mean, are these going to be high school kids? Are these going to be seniors? Are these going to be VCs or startuppers? So I think that it's not only communication, but people around communication or around these events who should probably pay attention to this, because I think a lot more value could be captured if there was a little more attention to this. And in general, just one more sentence at the end. I think that when it comes to the Hungarian ecosystem, I think many parts are already in place, operating pretty well in some loose form, but everything could be put into hyper speed if there was more communication between the players, and guess what? Within the players.
You bet. Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much, Vilmos, for
Thanks
being
for
here
the opportunity.
Thank you.
I think it is a great discussion, and thank you for watching us today, and we'll be back with another podcast next time. Thank you.